In the dry lands of ancient Israel, where the sun scorched the soil and the wind carried dust like whispers of forgotten battles, a powerful story was unfolding, one that would stretch the limits of human belief. It was a time when kings trembled at the mention of God's name, when the voice of a prophet could silence nations, and miracles were not myths but moments that shaped history. It all began with a man named Elisha. Not a warrior clad in armor, not a ruler seated on a throne, but a prophet, chosen by God, feared by kings, and followed by the desperate and the faithful alike. Elisha was no ordinary man. He healed poisoned waters, raised the dead, multiplied food for starving multitudes, and blinded entire armies without lifting a sword. His life was a journey drenched in fire, faith, and wonder. Each step he took echoed with purpose, and every word he spoke carried the weight of heaven. He came from humble beginnings. Elisha was the son of a farmer, raised among plows and oxen, tilling the soil under the burning Middle Eastern sun. He was not born into fame or fortune, yet his name, Elisha, meaning God is salvation, was a divine foreshadowing of the man he would become. His life changed forever on an ordinary day. The great prophet Elijah, fierce and anointed, passed by Elisha's field. Without a word, he removed his mantle, the sacred cloak of his prophetic office, and laid it on Elisha's shoulders. That single act was more than a call, it was heaven's invitation, and Elisha understood. Without hesitation, he slaughtered his oxen, burned his plow, and kissed his old life goodbye. He left behind comfort, security, and family to follow Elijah and become his servant, his student, and one day, his successor. The soil he once tilled would no longer define him. The fire of God would. For years, Elisha walked in Elijah's shadow, learning, observing, and serving faithfully. When others might have sought the spotlight, Elisha remained humble. Even when Elijah tested his loyalty, urging him to turn back, Elisha stood firm. Deep in his spirit, he knew something holy was coming. And then, it came. At the Jordan River, Elijah struck the waters with his mantle. The river parted like curtains in a grand theater, revealing dry ground. Together they crossed, a prophet and his heir. On the other side, Elisha made a bold request. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." It was not a plea for fame or power, but for the responsibility of continuing God's work, even greater than Elijah's. Elijah replied, "If you see me when I'm taken from you, it shall be yours." And suddenly, heaven answered. A chariot of fire, pulled by fiery horses, descended from the skies in a blaze of glory. In a whirlwind of divine fury, Elijah was taken up. Elisha stood stunned, his eyes filled with awe and tears. As the chariot vanished, Elijah's mantle fell to the earth. Elisha picked it up, and with that, a new chapter in Israel's story began. His first miracle came swiftly. The people of Jericho approached him. Their water was toxic, the land barren. Elisha asked for a bowl of salt. He walked to the spring, cast in the salt, and declared, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water." The poisoned waters turned pure. The dead land sprang back to life. It was only the beginning. But not all honored him. In Bethel, a group of boys mocked him, shouting, "Go up, you bald head." They ridiculed not just his appearance, but his calling. In a moment of chilling justice, 2 bears emerged from the forest and mauled 42 of them. It was a harsh reminder, mocking God's servant is no small offense. Still, Elisha's heart beat with compassion. One day, a widow came to him, her eyes swollen with tears. Her husband had died, and creditors were coming to take her sons as slaves. All she had left was a small jar of oil. Elisha gave a strange command. "Borrow as many empty vessels as you can, then pour." She obeyed, and the oil flowed, and flowed, and flowed. Jar after jar filled until there were no vessels left. What had once seemed worthless became a river of provision. She sold the oil, paid her debts, and saved her children. It was God's abundance unleashed through a single act of faith. In Shunem, a wealthy woman opened her home to Elisha. In return, he blessed her with a son, a miracle in her old age. Years passed and tragedy struck. The boy collapsed in the fields and died in her arms. Devastated, she saddled a donkey and rode with relentless hope to find the prophet. Elisha came to her home, shut the door, and laid upon the child. He prayed, stretched himself over the boy, and warmth returned. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Life had returned. A mother's joy was restored. God had answered. Elisha's life continued to overflow with divine power. During a famine, his followers unknowingly cooked a deadly stew filled with poisonous herbs. "There is death in the pot," they cried. Elisha threw in flour, and the poison vanished. The stew became safe. Life triumphed again. With only 20 loaves of barley and a few heads of grain, Elisha fed 100 men, and there were leftovers. A foreshadowing of an even greater miracle to come centuries later, when Jesus would feed thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then came Naaman, a Syrian commander, mighty in battle but marred by leprosy. He came seeking healing. Elisha didn't even meet him in person, but sent a message. "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times. Naaman, proud and offended, almost walked away. But his servants persuaded him. He obeyed, once, twice, 3 times, until the 7th. As he emerged from the water, his skin was clean, like a child's. His pride melted and his heart turned. "There is no God in all the world except in Israel," he declared. But Elisha's servant, Gehazi, allowed greed to enter his heart. He chased after Naaman and lied to take gifts. When Elisha confronted him, Gehazi stood silent. But God was not. Elisha pronounced judgment. The leprosy of Naaman would cling to Gehazi and his descendants. Even in the mundane, Elisha revealed God's power. When a borrowed axe head fell into the river, the borrower cried out in despair. Elisha threw a stick into the water, and the iron floated to the surface. A miracle for one man, but a message for all. No need is too small for God. When an army surrounded their city, Elisha's servant was terrified. But Elisha prayed, "Lord, open his eyes." The servant looked again and saw the hills ablaze with chariots of fire. Heaven's army stood ready. Elisha then struck the enemy soldiers blind, led them into the heart of Samaria, and restored their sight. Surrounded and vulnerable, they braced for death, but Elisha spared them. Mercy triumphed over vengeance. In Samaria, famine gripped the land. People ate anything they could find. Yet Elisha stood and declared, "By this time tomorrow, food will overflow." That night, God caused the enemy to hear the sound of an enormous army. In fear, they fled, leaving behind tents, food, and gold. The prophecy was fulfilled. Starvation turned into surplus. Years later, the Shunammite woman returned from exile to reclaim her land. She arrived at the palace just as Gehazi was telling her story to the king. Moved by the testimony, the king restored everything she had lost. In Damascus, Elisha met Hazael, a servant of the Syrian king. As Elisha looked into Hazael's eyes, he began to weep. "I know the evil you will do," he said. Hazael returned to his master and murdered him the next day. Elisha's words, once again, proved true. Elisha later sent a young prophet to anoint Jehu as king, with orders to destroy the wicked house of Ahab. Jehu obeyed. Jezebel, the infamous queen, taunted him from a window, but she was thrown down, trampled by horses, and eaten by dogs, just as the Lord had declared. In his final days, Elisha was visited by King Joash. The king wept, calling him the chariots and horsemen of Israel. Elisha instructed him to shoot arrows and strike the ground. Joash struck 3 times. Elisha was grieved. "You should have struck 5 or 6. You will only defeat your enemies 3 times. Even in death's shadow, Elisha shaped the future of a kingdom. And when he finally died, the story didn't end. Sometime later, a dead man was hastily thrown into Elisha's tomb. As the lifeless body touched Elisha's bones, it sprang back to life. Even in death, God's power surged through the prophet. Elisha's story is more than history. It's a living testament. His life reminds us, God still heals, God still provides, God still raises the dead, and He still works through those who believe. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread the message of hope, power, and unwavering faith. Until next time, remain blessed.